Hey everyone, volume 24 is a hefty one, and I apologize for it taking me longer than usual to get through it. The volume contains over 600 pages of articles, speeches, and notes written between April 3rd and June 3rd, 1917. The most important document in this volume is undoubtedly the April Theses, in which Lenin laid out a concrete and theoretically articulate plan for the class struggle in its transition from bourgeois democratic revolution to a socialist one. The most important of those theses or points being, of course, the slogan, "No support for the provisional government," a sort of interim government established after the abdication of Nicholas II. Lenin rightfully points out that it consisted of a cabinet of capitalist ministers with really no mandate from the people. He also pretty boldly called for no return to a parliamentary republic, the abolition of the police, the nationalization of all land, and the amalgamation of all banks into a single national bank, and a new international, among many other things in the April Theses. It's a short work, so if you have time, go and look at it. It is important to note, however, that the April Theses were not taken very seriously by many of the deputies in the Soviet, let alone members of Lenin's own party. So much of the subsequent work in this volume consists of him defending his positions against Menshevik naysayers, liberal newspapers, and even some people within his own party. A big question that concerned the liberal newspapers in their smear campaign against Lenin concerned his passage from Germany to Russia. They tried to paint him as an agent, suggesting that he would not have received a passage if not for cutting a deal with the Kaiser's government. Yet the arrangement seemed like a predetermined strategy to discredit the socialist immigrants abroad who were flowing into revolutionary Russia. Lenin said that the British government refused to allow passage of socialists back to Russia at the time, and that he and other Bolsheviks submitted requests to the provisional government and were completely ignored. So they took matters into their own hands. By that, he meant that they negotiated passage with the help of Swiss and German socialists, people like Karl Liebknecht, who were on the radical side of the German Socialist Party. Articles like Letter on Tactics, Blankism, The Dual Power, and Tasks of the Proletariat and Our Revolution expand upon the key ideas of the April Theses by way of combating criticism. For example, by referring to the 1848 French revolutionary Louis Blanc, Lenin means to separate himself from that of the Blanquists, who would change their stand from one of class struggle during the revolution to conciliation with the bourgeoisie at a critical time of revolution. Lenin says, we're not going to do that. In the 7th All-Russian Conference, which met in April, Lenin airs some caution by stating that so long as the provisional government retains the armed forces and does not use them as an instrument of class war, the party can engage in peaceful, prolonged, and patient class propaganda. He cautions against speaking of civil war until the people have come to realize the need for it, stating that, quote, "We are for civil war, but only civil war waged by a politically conscious class." I think that's an important point. This is because, as he warns, the government wants to see the Bolsheviks or the socialists or radicals in general make the first move to legitimate its own punitive response. Another interesting document from the All-Russia Conference in April was the resolution on the national question. As Lenin says, the provisional government wanted to continue the imperialist war because it too benefited from the annexations and the secret treaties in which the Allies promised the Tsar new territories in places like Armenia, in Turkey, and in Southeast Europe. Lenin says that the party's position on this and the national question is to reaffirm the right of all nations forming part of Russia to freely secede and form independent states. In a related document, Finland and Russia, he gives probably the clearest example of what he means. The Russian Empire formally controlled Finland, but gave it its own diet, since the Napoleonic times, the provisional government wanted to cut Finland a deal. But Lenin points out that a fair deal cannot be made between the two states until Finland is free. He rightfully points out that, quote, to be against the right of succession is to be for annexations. War and Revolution was a lecture that Lenin gave in May, where he laid out his conception of the historical circumstances that have led to the war. He uses the Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz quote that, quote, war is the continuation of policy by other means, to say that in the era of imperialism and intense competition between Britain and Germany, war was the only way that the two powers could carry out their expansionist designs. It is a captivating lecture worth reading that really does capture Lenin's conception of history really well. Lenin's campaign at this period was absolutely the systemic discrediting of the provisional government, and no incidents best exemplifies that whole campaign than the battle between the newspapers Reich, a liberal newspaper, and Robochaya Gazeta, a Menshevik paper, which unleashed countless articles attacking Lenin's passage from Germany, the so-called violent intentions of the Bolsheviks, and extolled the provisional government's peaceful intentions in the war. Lenin was clear that Pravda's role had to be to respond to all of this criticism directly to the workers and to the soldiers. Another example is the publication of the provisional government's note of April 18th that spoke of the desire to, quote, the whole nation to fight the world war to a decisive victory. He says that this is not a reflection of popular desires, but the desire of the ministers to uphold their obligations towards the allied nations, the bankers of France and Britain. Overall, what Lenin was most concerned with at this period was the conciliatory relations between the moderate socialists like Plekhanov and the liberals. He has another article entitled, quote, Looking for Napoleon, in which he says that the social upheaval caused by war in the cities and in the countryside exists because the provisional government has no mandate. And what the ministers are looking for is someone to essentially come in and destroy the trajectory of the revolution, which must otherwise culminate in the dictatorship of the proletariat, exercised by the Soviet of workers, soldiers, and peasants. That's all for today. I cannot possibly cover every article in this volume, but I think that this sufficiently covers where we're at in the major topics that Lenin was really engaging with. Until next time.